I look forward to talking with you today. As Pratt mentioned, I'm going to talk about the methodological bricolage. This is an approach that Scott Sonenshein, Martha Feldman, and I really batted around for quite a few years, actually, even before there was a special issue that we ultimately published it in. I should mention, though, anything stupid that I say should not be attributed to either of my co-authors. So that's all on me. Rather than to kind of just get us started, I thought I'd kind of like to walk you through what I'm going to talk about. I decided not to simply talk through the paper. I could read it aloud to you, but you could read it just as easily. So I thought I would give you a little bit more of the background on the kind of the background for why we wrote this paper in the first place. And then maybe spend some time on the paper itself, and then a few tips to actually using it, and we'll go from there, see where the questions take us. So the first thing just to talk about is about trustworthiness. And that's really at the heart of what we're going to talk about today. What makes for trustworthy qualitative research? Really focusing on management journals, not so much. There's, again, different disciplines have very different takes. The core problem that seems, at least that I see it as we don't have a lot of consensus on what makes for trustworthy research. There's a few camps out there. I'm going to talk about at least two that have very different, I would say, very respectable and legitimate, ways of looking at trustworthiness. Talk about the rise of templates for a bit, as I see that this was kind of I think a response to people thinking that qualitative research wasn't very trustworthy. And then finally, like I said, I'll talk a bit about bricolage. Now, bricolage is an approach to methods. It's not a method in of itself. And I will explain what I mean in a bit. So let's start with the basics. What do I mean by qualitative research? I'm always surprised when I do talks or I see talks on qualitative research, they don't specify what they mean. There's a lot of views out there. I'm not going to go into the controversies around what qualitative research isn't, but for now, let's think of it as a multi-method research. Multi-method meaning that there's a lot of different ways to do qualitative research. Probably the big three in our field are case studies, ethnography, and grounded theory. It's an interpretive and naturalistic approach, meaning qualitative research happens in the context where the people you're studying are working. And it's interpretive in the sense that you're interested in figuring out how they see the world. One of the reasons to do especially inductive qualitative research is to get into the mindset of the people you're studying. What's the purpose of a method section? First is to show what you've done in terms of how did you sample, how did you design your study, how did you how did you analyze your data? But I think as importantly, and I think this is where the difference between what we call a boilerplate method section and a method section that's going to be more satisfying to a reviewer is really talking about what critical choices you've made along the way. Because nobody, there are a variety of, for example, if you do grounded theory, there's a variety of ways to do grounded theory. It's often difficult to do anything in a perfect or pure way. And you're going to have to make choices. And one of the things you need to do in your method section is to talk about what choices have you made. Just to give you an example of some of the choices you could think about, you may talk about, why do you need qualitative research or qualitative methods for this study? This is particularly true, by the way, if you're doing qualitative research in what appears to be a well-researched topic area. So for example, we just, some co-authors and I published a paper on trust in ASQ. When we sent it to the Academy of Management, we got a reviewer back saying, how could you possibly do a qualitative paper on trust? Don't we know enough about trust already? Of course, the answer is there's always areas where we need to expand our knowledge. But again, you have to be sure to talk about why qualitative research is appropriate. This sounds very basic, but I'm always surprised as an editor. I think at this point, I've done 400 decisions plus at ASQ, probably a few hundred more at AMJ. So let's say a few hundred. I'm amazed how many people don't say what the purpose of their paper is. Is it to build theory or elaborate theory? Is it testing theory? What? You also may want to talk about your decisions for your context. What is the nature of the context I'm examining? A very popular thing right now is to talk about, well, actually, I've seen some pushback on it. People talk about using extreme cases. I've heard a lot. I've seen a lot of reviewers push back on what does extreme really mean. At the end of the day, I don't think it matters what term you use, whether you use revelatory or extreme or whatever. You want to find a context that's going to highlight the dynamics that you're looking at. And so again, talk about the rationale for why you not only why you choose this context, and then what you're studying in that context. Are you sampling events, cases, people? You know, what is your sampling strategy? You know, if you're doing grounded theories, you want to start out purposefully. You wouldn't do a random sample. You're going to start by choosing a sample that hopefully will, illustrate the dynamics you're interested in, and then move to more theoretical sampling as your theory emerges. And then talk about your analysis. How did you study these things? How did you analyze the data? And one that, again, a big one that I've seen that a problem is people often don't link their theory with their data. So let's say I coded, here are my codes, and then poof, you have a figure at the end of the paper, and we have no idea how you got from the codes to the figure. So those are some of the choices you need to kind of flesh out in your method section. And the reason why it's important, there's a very pragmatic reason for this, and that's it. Your reviewers and your editor have to judge you've done this right. They have to believe that what you've done is a trustworthy way of doing research. So I'm going to kind of dig into what trustworthiness means and how we thought about it as a field. So this is from Lincoln and Guba. They said, the basic issue in relation to trustworthiness is simple. How can the acquirer or the author persuade his or her audiences, including themselves, that the findings of an inquiry are worth paying attention to and worth taking account of? In other words, should I believe what you wrote? The problem is, it'd be great if we had I'm not sure it would be great, but it would be easier perhaps if we agreed on what it meant to be trustworthy and how to persuade somebody. But right now we're just not at that. We're not at that state in our methods. And quite honestly, I'm not sure we really actually ever want to drill down to just one single criteria or standard. But let's talk a little bit about what some of these things we talk about. There's at least two camps as I see it out there. And there is a camp that essentially uses traditional. When I mean traditional, I'm talking about quantitative, often positivist research. And the goal for these people is to be trustworthy is essentially to try to mimic somehow or try to replicate qualities of, that would be trustworthy quantitative research, like internal, external validity, things such as that, reliability. But there's another camp that vehemently disagrees with that and says that good qualitative research should be evaluated differently than other research. And of course, there's people that are somewhere in the middle. But those, I thought that might be a good place to start. So let's look at the core problem here. Actually, I like this graphic. It's not mine, but I thought it was pretty cool. So let's look at camp number one. I would put a couple of different people here. I put Yin. So if you look at Yin's, Lin is done, I think he's on maybe version 6. So I'm not sure what the latest version of his book is. But essentially what Yin talks about, he's a case study person. And he said, well, there's ways that you can essentially get at things like construct validity and reliability through qualitative methods. So for example, if you want to get a construct validity, in other words, are you actually, is your concept what you're saying it is? Is this really identity for studying identity? Yin says, well, you could use multiple sources of data and triangulate. So if they agree on something, maybe that means you're getting at the right construct. It helps to establish a chain of evidence. A chain of evidence simply means, can I follow the argument from your coding to your theorizing? So I don't know, we'll talk a little about like a Joya table. Joya table is essentially, the purpose of a Joya table, I think, is to really be clear on what your chain of evidence is. And you may have member checks with people. In other words, you go to the people in your site, and you may ask them about, am I on the right things? Are my findings, legitimate? And there's some controversies around when you do member checks. And if we have time later, I'd happy to talk about that. So those are kind of ways to get at construct validity. There is no way to actually do statistical generalization with qualitative research, but you can do some of it. You can approach that. One is through multiple case study logic. So if you're familiar with the Eisenhart method, her whole approach is to use multiple case studies. Again, you're not going to generalize around. You're not going to generalize like you had a sample of 500 Fortune 500 companies, but that helps. You can also use analytic generalizability. So you can create theory, and the theory itself may be generalizable. Another way to think about this, which is not necessarily from Yin, is naturalistic. To talk about, well, what contexts are similar enough to your study to show that, yeah, I might be able to some people call it transferability, transfer my understandings from this context to another one. And reliability, can it be replicated? If you've read any of my research, you'll see that I think this is pretty controversial. I actually don't believe that this should be a goal of qualitative research. However, if you do believe it's a goal of qualitative research, you want to use a standardized protocol that somebody else could use, and you want to use a case study database. What all this means is you want to meticulously keep notes on everything that you've collected, all the notes you've taken, so that if somebody else, you're able to give them and totally throw out any issues of confidentiality and anonymity. You decided to want to do that they would come up with a similar conclusion. Lincoln and Guba also talked about, they kind of, again, they kind of moved in this direction as well. And some of their early work, as I'll talk about later, they moved away from this later. I'm not going to go over all the things in their book. It is a really nice book, Naturalistic Inquiry. But they talk about credibility that has investigated, represented those constructions of reality adequately. Naturalistic inquiry takes as a fundamental starting point that there's multiple realities. So it starts to move away from positivism. But your goal then, I want to say goal, your obligation even as a researcher is to give voice to these multiple conceptions of reality in your context. And that's credibility. Transferability, in other words, this is similar to some other contexts you might be able to learn some lessons from. So if there's an example is if I really know a lot about an oak tree, I probably have some understanding of what a maple tree is like. There's also a Chinese proverb that it says something to the effect of the sparrow is small but has all the organs. So if you understand a sparrow inside, it's just like a lot of other birds. You get some understanding of what those other things are. And then confirmability. They don't talk about replicability. They talk about, can the data be verified? When they talk about this, they really talk about, do you have good data? Can you show, did you have good data? It's really more of a function of the data than it is about the data gatherer. So again, just to give you a little bit more detail on this, they have other criteria as well. But how do you establish credibility? Could be then you're in the context for a long period of time. So ethnographies have a really good advantage here because ethnographies are really into the, usually in the context for quite a bit of time. Persistent observations, which helps gives you depth. So look at the same things over and over for a prolonged period of time. Lincoln and Guba also talk about triangulation, getting different sources of data, but you can also have triangulation around methods. You can have triangulation around different investigators if you're using a team qualitative study. You can do peer debriefing. Peer debriefing, essentially talking with your colleagues and bouncing ideas off them. So does this make sense to you? And again, member checks, talking with the people in the context you're studying and say, hey, does this match your idea of what, what you found? Does that gel with their reality on some level? Again, how to get transferability, provide a lot of details, a thick description. And for them, confirmability, again, very similar to what Yin talks about. Keep an audit trail, keep a record of your data, how you coded, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one way of thinking about trustworthiness in qualitative research. Again, like I said, there's a lot of legitimate reasons for doing so. Let me tell you what it's not, though. Some people, just to say, not to confuse what Camp 1 isn't. Camp 1 isn't is essentially mimicking qualitative research, because you'll be mimicking a quantitative data analysis. For example, trying to quantify your data, your qualitative data. Let me be clear on this. If you're doing an archival study and you have 100 or thousands of observations, quantify the heck out of it, have a good time. I'm talking about people who do 45, 50 interviews and then say, well, 15 people said X and 20 people said Y. I'm not really sure with an N that small, quite honestly, that's a meaningful difference. And I think it puts you down a pretty dark path that people are going to start asking you for t-tests and other kinds of things that you probably don't want to do. Another issue of quantification of qualitative data is that I think it actually misses on, take for granted meetings. My favorite example of this is we surveyed people who published qualitative papers in top tier journals over a 10-year period. I'm blocking on what the time period was. And we asked them, what does it take to get into a top tier management journal? Any guesses on how many people said has to be on a management topic? 0, none. Does that mean it's not important to have a management topic? Of course not. They just thought that was so obvious. Why would they say anything about it? That happens in interviews as well. There's some things that people just take for granted they may not mention. And so if you quantifying your data, you're missing stuff that are taken for granted by the people that you're talking about. The second thing I think it gets difficult is, what are your cutoffs? What's a meaningful number of utterances, that I should believe you? One of the most famous papers, qualitative papers, the Port Authority paper by Dutton and Dukerich, some of their themes that became important were, I think were mentioned by 25 or less in their data, like 25 people or fewer in their data. Or I don't know if that was a number count or a theme count, but even so, not a lot of people, but somehow it was significant. But I'm not sure where the cutoff is. I think more dangerously for those who are doing qualitative research is that it creates quantitative expectations. That once you kind of go down this road of quantifying, well, then I want to know more. I wanted to quantify more. That could be a problem. And then finally, and I'll get off my soapbox for quantification of qualitative data. That is, I actually think the likelihood to do violence to experience, I think, is pretty high. So violence to experience is essentially, well, let me just take a step back. I said the reason why you do qualitative research is to get at the worldview of the people that you're studying. If you take that worldview and essentially you don't represent it in your paper, you just, for example, let's say you make it into a theory paper or just, count up the number of people who said X or Y. Well, that is not being true to the experience you had of the people that you studied. So that's what I've heard about by doing violence to experience. So for example, I could say, I did a talk at AOM in Seattle at some point, way back. I won't say how far back because I just won't say it. But I would give an example of people waiting. Our flight was delayed for 2 hours. I take it back. It was in Vancouver. We were stuck in Seattle. And I said, well, one way you could talk about how people reacted to say 35 people in the waiting room seemed upset and 5 people did not. That's certainly an okay way to talk about it. But isn't it much better to talk about what people were doing, how they responded, how people were pacing back and forth, going up to the counter, how people were complaining among themselves, things that they said? It gives you a much richer understanding of what it was like to sit there for 2 hours in a grungy airport terminal, not knowing when your flight's going to take off. Second thing is a no not to do is don't inappropriately combine deductive quantitative techniques with inductive research without justifying it. So I've just seen papers that without missing a beat said, oh, I'm using grounded theory and I did random sampling. Oh, okay. Random sampling is not typically what we do with grounded theory. Why is that? Maybe the author had a great rationale for doing that, but unless you say something about it, it just looks bad. And finally, what I'm not talking about with Camp 1 is don't use deductive shorthand to talk about your qualitative data. I had somebody right now is a very famous qualitative researcher that I was an editor of one of their papers and used, this is a line from their paper. They said, I controlled for variance in my study. All they meant is that, they try to get an alternate explanation in their study, but once they say control for variance, the reviewers were all over that. Like, how did you control for variance? What were your controls? So again, a kind of a long segue to say, when I'm talking about camp one, it's not actually using quantitative analyses in qualitative data. It's using the criteria for what makes for good qualitative research, and they borrow the standards from quantitative data and just bring them over to qualitative data. That's camp one. Camp two says there's actually no analogous criteria. So Lincoln and Guba later in their career said, some time ago we expressed hope that all social scientists could work with a common discourse, but they said such a resolution appears highly unlikely. It would probably be less than useful. So they kind of gave up the whole project. And again, at least since I've been around, I have not seen a consistent standard that has arisen for what makes good qualitative research. Doesn't mean people haven't tried. So let me give you an example of criteria that tries to get at something that, what is good qualitative research that really hits on the actual strengths of qualitative research. So Golden, Biddle, and Locke, Karen, two of my favorite authors of all time. I'm going to make a short plug for their book. By the way, if you were looking to writing up your data for qualitative studies, their book, Composing Qualitative Research, is phenomenal. Anyway, they did a paper on, well, how do people convince folks in an ethnography that their data is trustworthy? And they came up with 3 criteria. One is authenticity. Was the author there in the field? Were they genuine to experience? You could do this by using terms of the vernacular. So I did a study of Amway. Amway is a direct selling organization. They use terms like dream building, stinking thinking, getting out of your comfort zone. Using terms like that, it kind of shows people, yeah, you were actually there. You didn't just like look them up in a book. The second criteria, they say, how about plausibility? Do people buy it? In other words, can they make sense of it? And maybe more importantly, does it make a contribution to the literature? And finally, they said, did it achieve criticality? This is like a high bar for any paper, qualitative or quantitative. Does this research make you rethink your fundamental assumptions about the field or about your own work? And they said, if you can do these 3 things, your paper is trustworthy. Again, there's no mention there of internal validity, reliability, and things such as that. So one more way that I'm going to take some questions. Another way to think about this is kind of pre-template, before we had templates. There have been some steps that, again, are uniquely qualitative, but it starts to approach, I would say, a template format. That is, I don't know if you've seen any grounded theory papers out there, but a lot of them have a logic that's very similar to this. And again, the logic is correct, but you got to say more than this. So the first thing he said, all right, I did my qualitative study. First, I coded close to the data. I used open codes or first order codes. Then I abstracted them out. I used Axio codes, second order codes, descriptive codes if you're using Sharma's. And by the way, I explored how they fit together. Well, that's lovely, but it's so generic that I have no idea what you're doing. Again, but this gets more at, it starts getting at, I'm doing trustworthy research by really drawing on the logic and grounded theory. But again, this is my segue into templates. So let's stop here and see what questions we have before I get into the impasse and where we're going from here. Any questions at this point? Perfect understanding the first time. That's pretty good. I'm thank you. That's great.
Mike, if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
Oh, I can see firsthand, but maybe I can just ask first question. So I understand you as you said, you looked at hundreds of qualitative papers as a reviewer and as an editor, over a long period of time. What is your sense in terms of how the qualitative research has been evolving and changing in this respect with the trustworthiness?
I think probably the biggest change, I mean, I kind of see it in phases. I think the first phase, there wasn't a lot of structure to qualitative, I think because people were new to it. And so when people were trying to explain it, they often did like theme counts. So I teach a qualitative methods class. I use a lot of older qualitative papers, 90s, not old for me, but old for some of you. And that, it very much, you can see a lot of mimicking quantitative criteria. As we've moved on, I think it's gotten a little bit more to a little more structured. I think people I think we've kind of come out to a somewhat of a standardized way of writing qualitative research. It used to be, for example, that you could write a qualitative paper and simply just have an introduction without a really big lit review, go right into the methods and have most of your theory at the end. I find that I hardly see any papers like that anymore. Another change has been, I think a lot of people right now have now put their context within their method section. And so people spend a lot of time describing their context, which I think is a good thing. Again, more structure. I think that eventually led to a really an emphasis on templates, so much so that as an editor, I would have reviewers telling people, I need to see a Joya table in this paper, or I need you to do X, Y, and Z. And I actually think there's been some pushback on that. And now I think it's going back to a little bit, I think much more, I think like what I'm hoping to see is what I'm seeing is, much more describing what you did, describing the choices you made, but not necessarily being as rigid, and one more, I think, borrowing from different qualitative approaches as opposed to just grounded theory, which has been, I think, been in this grounded theory in cases pretty much been the standards.
Thank you, Mike. I can see there are 3 hands now. Maybe Barry could go first.
Hi. I have 2 questions. First is you were talking about, that quantitative research has these cutoffs, but in qualitative research, when we're trying to come up with first order categories, second order categories, and then the eventual theme, don't you think there are cutoffs there as well? Like we have to sort of look into which of the categories are emerging the most when we're analyzing our qualitative data. The second thing is about templates. So do you think templates are useful? Sometimes do you because the kind of research that you're doing, you need to follow that template. So when is it useful to follow them and when not? Probably. Yeah, that's my question.
Well, the good news is the rest of my talk will answer your second question. That's pretty much what it's entirely built on. The first question, I think you have to, I think this is where it's important to have done your own, I think it's difficult when you are analyzing data you haven't collected, but I do find that you can't just go by the number of times a theme comes up to what your first order codes are. I think you need to have a richer understanding of your field. That's why I think being immersed in your field, talk with people, observing, you'll find that even things that maybe aren't mentioned a lot could be really important because it gets at this, take it for granted meanings. And quite honestly, I think you should have as many first order codes as you possibly can make. I don't necessarily think there should be a cutoff. What I tend to find is that people tend to overly restrict their first order coding, and that leads to a very superficial analysis later on the line. If you think about, especially, grounded theory, or I'd say even more the Joya method, if you think about what the Joya method does is have, like first order codes, a ton of them, and then there should be fewer than second order codes and even fewer abstracted theoretical categories, right? What I think is problematic when I see a paper that has one first order code leads to one second order code leads to one aggregate dimension, that totally is not getting at what I think what the authors were trying to get at, which is you want to start with a really rich set of first order codes and build from that, and don't overly restrict yourself. I think, especially at the beginning, because I think the bigger your foundation, the stronger your building will be. Thanks for the question. Did that get to it? Good.
Alicia?
Hi, Michael. Thanks so much for giving this talk. I'm really enjoying it so far. I wanted to ask you, you talked about when you're doing an archival study, quantify as much as you like. And
all right, I will rephrase that. If you're doing quantitative studies, let's say you're doing, you want to study annual reports and you're doing like a content analysis of how, the use of the word vision and mission. And you have, you go through your thing and you find you have 3,500 mentions of it. Then I think it's okay to quantify.
Understood that part. But what I'm struggling with is my So I'm an engineer by background, and
Mhm.
I don't know why I'm doing a qualitative study, but I am. And one of the things that I'm really struggling with is this getting into the mind of the people involved in my research case. And quite frankly, my brain just goes on the fritz trying to like make sense of people's different perspectives. And I feel a lot safer in my secondary data, Twitter, tweets and news articles and all of those things. How do you create like solace for yourself when you're struggling to get into the minds of your interviewees? Very difficult question.
Yeah, no. So one is I tend to accompany a lot of my research with observations and just hanging out with the people. I find that it does two things. So number one is it creates a sense of trust between myself and the people that I'm talking to, and I get better data. But also I think I have a better understanding of what things mean in context. I think the other way to think about it is talk with somebody at the organization to say, hey, I'm having a hard time. Here's a struggle I'm having. I'm seeing this in my data and this. Can you help me work? Can you help me figure this out? So for example, in Amway, when I started the study, there was all this thing about put God first, family second, business third. Yet I saw a speaker that said, hey, it's okay to miss your kid's birthday and sell that, and I said, can you help me out with this? I'm having a hard, I'm having a hard time with that. And they said, oh, okay, let me help you understand is that we talk about putting family first, we're talking about their long-term needs. And that wouldn't you like to be able to have financial security for your family? So they had a rationale for it, but I didn't know what that rationale was. So sometimes just talking with folks and you can ask them pretty pointed questions. You say, hey, I'm having a hard time understanding this part of what I'm hearing. Can you help me out?
Cool. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Louisa?
Hi, Michael.
Hi.
Hi. And thank you for your time today. And I would like to ask you something regarding the how do we justify the appropriateness of a qualitative study? And how do you perfectly do it? And also if there's a difference in justifying it to a grant and to a journal, because I'm having difficulties in how to perfectly say that this is qualitative. Like all the professors that I talk with that are qualitative, they understand it. I don't need to justify it, but apparently some people I cannot justify it enough. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a loaded question. So first of all, you can't do it perfectly. So that's a good news. That should take some pressure off. I still mess up all the time. So that's if that helps. I think part of it is because people have such different takes on what is trustworthy, that it's very difficult to know a priori what you're going to get when you submit a paper. So I'll talk about what some things that you should have. Like remember, those core questions: justifying why you're doing the study, justifying your context, justifying your sampling, and talking about your methodological choices. If you have that, I think you're pretty safe to at least get a revision. But again, what to me, then you find out what kind of reviewers am I getting? Some people may say, I know you spent 5 pages on why this is reliable, but just cut that out. Or some people said, I don't hear enough about reliability, put some more stuff in. So I think the best you can do is justify the core choices that you've made in your study, cite the appropriate research. I think it's pretty frustrating for a reviewer, an editor at this point in time in history to not have any methodological citations. And I still see method section without any methodological citations. And I'm like, wow, did you make all this stuff up? Like, did you really need to? So, justify your choices with that. And I think what Karen Locke and Karen Golden-Biddle would argue in their paper, or that book I told you about, Composing Qualitative Research, is a lot of this is just a rhetorical accomplishment. And so what I'm trying to do today is help you become better in your arguing for why this is a good way to do it. But you're not going to get a perfect way because there isn't an agreed upon way.
Okay, and just one follow-up question, because for now I still don't have the paper, so it would be for a grant, and I don't have the data to kind of justify the sample, the context, okay, but the sample, I can say that I'm going to use that sample, but I don't have data to back
Oh,
it
so it
up?
sounds like you said for a grant. All right, so I'll give you again a little background because I've done similar kinds of things. And what I have found is I actually have to give a mini qualitative tutorial to the people who are, I do, because the people who are analyzing the study, because most of them may not have any idea what qualitative research is. I did one and they sent it back saying, well, you're clearly not far along in your thinking because you don't have hypotheses. All right, well, okay, let me tell you what qualitative research is about. So, you would say that, in qualitative research, cite, no, don't say qualitative research. First thing you do for context, I want to find a context where I think the dynamics I'm observing are going to be observable. So, and then for sampling, say qualitative research, you start with what we call purposeful sampling, which is I do this for a reason. So if I'm looking at, for example, commitment to an organization, I'm going to start with people who I see are pretty highly committed and people who don't seem to be committed at all. As my study evolves, my sampling may change, and that's all part of doing a qualitative study. So it's really educating your reviewer, in this case, what qualitative methods are, that you're doing it for a reason. Because again, most of them probably will not, especially for grants, I'm not sure I found anybody with qualitative experience who've done, who really, like, I don't do a lot of grant writing, but in my minimal experience, I haven't seen it yet. Maybe they exist. But so, yeah, so I think it's okay to say, hey, qualitative research is a little different from quantitative research. And sometimes I even make these things clear. So if I was doing, other than random sampling, qualitative research, we pick purposeful sampling, and here's why. And, so just help your reviewer out, help them say yes.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Mike, on the topic of trustworthiness and also quantifying things, how many interviews is enough? I think that's probably one of the questions that qualitative researchers struggle with. Because one of the things I'm seeing, for example, in some of the qualitative papers in the MJ, some have over 100 interviews they've done, in addition to other methods, such as observations and archival. Others have 90, others have 70, others even have 30 or 40. Yep.
So there's a couple of different ways to answer this. So I like this is attributed to Abraham Lincoln. Somebody asked Abraham Lincoln, how long should a man's legs be? And he said, long enough to reach the floor. So that's essentially, there is no magical number. If you're, for example, if I'm studying U.S. Supreme Court justices and I get 9 of them, that's pretty amazing, right? Because there's only, so I think, again, the big thing is that you justify, so why was this enough? And so usually the gold standard for justification for when to stop collecting data is theoretical saturation. And there's 2 ways to think about theoretical saturation. One is more kind of that I attributed maybe wrongly to kind of like the Corbin and Strauss thing with, they essentially see theoretical saturation in the data collection. Like if I'm learning anything new from interviews as I'm gathering them, I can stop. Sharma's, I think I like a little better. She talks about theoretical saturation are the constructs that I'm proposing fully saturated? In other words, do I understand? Do I essentially understand to a good degree what these contracts are about? And so you essentially have to justify why there is no magical number. I agree with you. I have found a numbers creep, so that if you look historically from articles written in the 80s, 90s, aughts, and 10s, you're seeing this creeping up of hundreds. Some people are doing hundreds and hundreds of interviews, but again, it really depends on what your research question is, what your theoretical arguments are, and again, for a lot of people, were you able to reach theoretical saturation? Again, because there's some things like we're doing a study right now. Because it's under review, I'm not going to say the population. Just say it's a population. There's just not a lot of people, so we're not going to get like 300 interviews because there's probably not. There's not a lot of these people around. So your job as an author is to really justify. Here's why this was enough. And again, theoretical saturation is a really good one. You could talk about it being from a very small sample, like I said, like a Supreme Court justice. But that's kind of what you have to do. There really isn't a magic number.
And what is your view if you feel you have a theoretical saturation when to collecting data, but then you start analyzing data and you realize that perhaps there are other things that are emerging that you didn't explore in depth? Do you go and collect more data in order to kind of further extend the saturation point?
I do. This is why it's so important to analyze data as you're gathering it. My own personal, like what I typically do is I will collect like 10, like if I'm doing an interview study, I'll actually do 10 interviews, stop, analyze the data, see what I have. Often I will refine my protocol, gather some more data, maybe do 10 more, but you don't want to get like 50 interviews. I mean, if you can help it, I guess sometimes it's just a practical matter. An organization gives you a week, you collect as much data as you can, and you don't have the time to reflect. But if you can do it, reflect, gather some data, analyze it. Because what happens if you're not doing that, not only do you not get theoretical saturation, you don't know about it. The other thing is that you tend to end up with really thin data. So I've seen people, for example, who've done, I would say, I'll give an example, like they've done 100 interviews, but they're 100 essentially entry-level interviews. So they didn't analyze their data to all the interviews were in. And so they had really thin, they have I'm trying to think what would be the kilometer wide and a centimeter deep. Yeah. Mile wide, inch deep, if you're using the old measurement system. But and so anyway, it's very thin, and so it's not very good. So I've seen people that have done like 100 interviews, but their data is just not very good. So it's not really the number; it's more on the depth. How long your interviews are. Are you getting? Have you been able to revise your questions to get deeper at some topics? And again, the constant, I'm constantly going back and getting data as you find these new things, going back and collecting more data.
Thank you, Mike. And on this topic of saturation, Luis Mingueta has a question in the chat. If you have different groups, interviews, should I get saturation inside each of these groups or for the entire participants?
I think the answer is neither. I think what you want to get is saturation around your theoretical constructs, not around a group of people, unless for some reason that group of people is your construct. But in general, I think you want to look at that saturation as around a construct, not so much as a population of people, if that makes sense. I'd have to know more about the question, but that would be my first answer. I think, if you're doing like a multiple case study, that you may want to figure out what's going on in one study pretty well first before moving on. But I wouldn't talk about that necessarily in terms of saturation per se.
Thank you, Mike.
By the way, all those out here who are nodding their heads, that's really helpful because I see a lot of like very blank screens. And so it's nice. It's difficult to do a talk like this and you don't know if anybody's hearing you. So, all right, looks like we have another question. Roman?
Oh, yeah. So for me, one question is, so I think there's a big difference between actually doing the study and writing up the study later for the journal. Because I find I go in with one idea, do some interviews, another topic pops up. So I'm going to refine the whole thing and then focus on that point and write it up for the journal or the article later. So how much do I communicate about I go in with topic X and come out with topic Y? Because I see it in some studies and other studies seem totally neat. Like they thought about this in the beginning and went in. So I'm not sure if you're getting what I'm going at. Yeah,
actually, I think it's coming to be almost a script now in inductive studies. In fact, I think that's how a lot of inductive studies try to show that it was truly inductive, that they went in with X and found Y. If you go in and there's nothing like that, then you start to wonder, did they simply find what they were looking for? So in some ways, not having that is a little problematic, unless you've said, how were you open to discovery? Because if you said, I did a study of, how identity development, and we thought, and at the end, it was just about identity development. Then I start to wonder, were you so closed in your data gathering that nothing new came up? There was no discovery. So if I were me, I would almost always talk about how your analysis shifted over time.
Thank you very much.
There was something I think that just came up in chat about qualitative propositions. If you want to do that, I would say actually Eisenhardt just came out with a new article on they said, what is the Eisenhardt method really? One of the things that Kathy sees, I think, as one of the goals of qualitative research from her perspective is to actually create testable hypotheses. So I would start there as a good place, at least a good starting point for reading. Yin's not bad too. Other questions? There is. How about we move on and then we will get to even more questions. Confuse you at a higher level, maybe. All right, so I'm going to skip that one. So essentially, we're at, there is this impasse that and then some people are lamenting, oh, we don't have a standardized way of doing things. Our field is ruined, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think that's the case, obviously. So I wrote this was an editorial for AMJ that it was all about, the kingdom is lost because people can't seem to figure out what the structure is. And really, there's always a trade-off with structure, right? It's not that you can't have structure and creativity. And in fact, I think you need some structure to have creativity. But in general, I think it's obviously think of extremes. You can get so caught into following a particular way of doing things that you lose any creativity that you had. One thing I really love about inductive and qualitative research is that I think it gives you more degrees of freedom to be creative. So your job as an author is to show me that somehow that you have a story that coheres. And how you do that is we'll talk about, there's different ways to do that. So as I mentioned, if the problem is trustworthiness, and there's all these differing views of what trustworthiness, one is the solution. Well, one solution has been, well, let's just have templates, right? So that kind of goes on there. And so there has been, I think Langley and Abdullah's paper is excellent. I think probably one of the first that really call out this issue of templates, and they identify two core templates in management research. One is the Eisenhardt method, which is more case studies. I would say more positivist. I know Kathy just talked about a paper that she's not fully positivist, but I mean, she's interested in reliability and generating hypotheses to be testable. So it's certainly more positivist than, let's say, like a Sharma's and some grounded theorists. And then there's the Joya method, which is primarily grounded theory and interpretive. And again, what both of these, again, if I can speak for another, I hate to kind of speak for somebody else, but in general, I think both of them were trying to figure out how do we communicate qualitative research in such a way that people are going to take it seriously. And so, and both of them talk about they don't want their methods being used in a very rote fashion, a very template-like fashion. The problem is that they have been. So there was alarm that went up several years ago about that too many people are using templates. Again, I tend to get a lot of papers with the Joya method, which in and of itself, again, there's no problem with it, but people weren't using it in a thoughtful manner. And again, even the creator said, "Hey, don't use this in a template-like manner." But that's what people have done. So I just want to give us call out to, there's a special issue that's coming out in organization research methods. It's a lovely set of articles. I don't think I've even seen all of them, but all I know is it's changed how I do a qualitative research class here every other year. I've had more new entries into my qualitative methods class this year than ever before because of this special issue. So it's online now. I think it's coming out in hard copy soon. I probably should know that, but I do not. So templates, again, methodological templates are essentially, well, we're thinking of them as kind of rote or standardized ways of doing qualitative research. There are some pros to having like a template. The first is it's really nice for a quantitative reviewer to see the template and say, okay, you follow the template, your research is probably trustworthy. I found that quantitative reviewers in general love templates. And it's also actually been helpful, I think. And the second thing is, I think it's really been a bridge or a gateway for people who have never done qualitative research before They say, oh, if there's a template, I feel more comfortable with it. Maybe I'll, the phrase I've heard a lot is I'll dip my toe into qualitative research. I just as an aside, that drives me nuts. It's like saying, I'm going to dip my toe and I'm going to do an R study instead of using R. Like you wouldn't say that, but anyway, I digress. So, I think it's been good. I think there's more qualitative papers out there than there ever have been before, in part because papers like, the Eisenhard method and the Joya method has brought a lot of new people into the qualitative fold. Because again, I think what a lot of people don't like about qualitative research is there's a lot of uncertainty. Because it's not spelled out A, B, C, D, there's a lot of choice. There's a lot of, it's a lot of decisions. There's some art to it. And that makes some people very uncomfortable. The cons of it, though, I think is that I find, like, for example, when I read the Joy method, super helpful, in part because I've been doing this for a long period of time. And I know the background to why they wrote this article and what the problems they're trying to solve. However, if you haven't had that background, you look at this and say, oh, this is the complete method. This is all I need to do. And I've seen people say, oh, I'm going to use a Joy method. I said, what exactly are you going to do? Well, I'm going to create 3 columns of codes, put them in a table, and create a figure. That's what it is. Like, good luck with that, because that's really not that. It's necessarily incomplete. There's a lot of judgment calls that you're not getting at. I mean, they've written like a really great article on it, but it wasn't a book. They didn't get a chance to really get into research questions or sampling and some of this other stuff. They have a really great article on the analysis part. And then they don't realize that, if you have the 3-column structure, that's not your analysis. That's a way to kind of, essentially show other people what the analysis you've done. It's a way to kind of represent your analysis, but it's not the analysis. There's a lot of iteration that goes on. There's a lot of other things that go on. And yeah, maybe at the end of the day, you end up with 3 columns, but the 3 columns is not your purpose, and nor is it the end all and be all of your data analysis. And because if you don't know why you're doing it, for example, why are you even creating a 3-column structure? Well, then you can't explain to a reviewer what you did. And I mean, again, I see this a lot as an editor where they, like I said, I'll see somebody who said, we use a Joya method and they have 2 first-order codes, 1 second-order code, and that leads to 1 aggregate dimension. And look at it saying, you clearly didn't understand the logic behind it, because the whole logic is moving from the informant's voice, aggregate it to be a little more theoretical, and then finally kind of creating theoretical categories. If you knew that, you wouldn't have just 2 first-order codes. And then what happens is that if people understand, they get it rejected, and then they're going, I don't understand. I thought I did everything like I was supposed to do. Why isn't this working out? I'm not sure this is going to be a dangerous analogy, so I may take it back after I say it. But one way to think about it, if anybody's ever done any cooking or baking, I'm the baker in our family. You can follow the recipe and it still turns out like, that's because there's some art to it. Like you kind of figure out, oh, when they said a half teaspoon, it's really kind of better to do like a little less than that and a little more on something else. So I make pancakes for my kids, for my family every Friday. And I've changed that recipe 5 or 6 times. So the recipe helps, it's a good starting point, but it is not the process of cooking, for sure. I think the other danger of using templates is that I think it narrows our field too much. I'll have people I'll go on a little bit of a tangent, but I've had people saying, hey, can you do a paper on qualitative methods in organizational behavior? I said, no, I cannot, because it's like saying you would ask somebody, could you do a quantitative, one paper that's going to represent all of qualitative data analysis? It can't happen. Like there's a richness there, I think, even more than a lot of people know. Again, there's the big 3, there's case studies, there are grounded theory, there's ethnography, but there's also phenomenology, narrative analysis, and a bunch of discourse analysis. It's a pretty wide and rich field, but we actually have only templates around case studies and grounded theory. And to me, that has it has the potential of really narrowing our field and blinding us to other qualitative methodological approaches. So like for example, at ASQ, I really wanted, there was a paper that I accepted that it was a psychodynamic analysis. Again, no template for that. But again, I think we need to be open to a lot of different ways of knowing. And again, because it restricts the kind of stories we tell, then I think ultimately restricts our theorizing, which is not good for the field. So come into Pratt, Sonenshein, and Feldman. We see this issue. And actually, this paper came about really as because we were all editors of journals. I was at ASQ, Scott was at AMJ, Martha was at Org Science. We're saying, no, by the way, Jessica, there is no narrative analysis template out there, as far as I know. Reisman, though, is a good book if you want to read about it. But sorry, it just popped up on my screen. But we were really concerned about reviewers or authors feeling pressure to do, let's say, the Joya method. Reviewers saying, I'm not going to accept your paper. Like, I need to see a data structure. We just thought, this seems to be pushing too far. So we said, well, how else could we think about it? So we come up with methodological bricolage, which is the combining of analytic moves for the purpose of solving a problem related to your research, certainly your own research program. And there's a few things there I want to unpack. The first thing is that it does it rather than think about it as like a method, like grounded theory, case study, ethnography. Think about each method has a variety of analytic moves you could use. So for example, a case study has an analytic move of case selection, right? So case replication is like an analytic move for a multiple case study analysis. And so we're kind of breaking down whole methods into the different practices that people use. The second thing, you do that to solve a particular research problem that is actually, it's your problem. It's unique to your study. So as I'll take you through one example, like each paper you write has its own challenges. And how do you meet those challenges is by bricolaging or bricolaging your methods to help people to solve the problem you're trying to get at. So let me give you some more detail on what I mean. So first thing is to say, this is not a method in the sense of we're really talking about how to think about methods. That's how we think about it, the bricolage approach. So it's more, we don't have like 5 steps to the methodological bricolage approach on purpose. We were really worried that people were going to take this and say, oh, this is just another template. So at the end of the day, and I'll say this at the end of the talk, if we have time, is that we really want people to do is be much more mindful about their methods. What we were seeing too many boilerplate, unthinking, uncritical method sections. So think about what you're doing, communicate those thoughts to the people that are reading your paper. We like bricolage in particular because it highlights that you're not a passive, you're not a passive follower of a template or anything. That it involves your own creativity or your own agency. So it involves your own understanding or knowledge of, in bricolage terms, the available resources. The available resources here would be the various methodologies and various moves. Combining resources for a new purpose. That's, the new purpose is your research question. Your study is going to be different. It's not going to fit any kind of classic mold. So how do you change things to help you solve your own problems? And then the ultimate thing on an effective bricolage, it's just not anything goes. You have to create an effective arrangement at the end of the day. So let's talk about what does effective arrangement mean? How do you make one? Well, you make an effective arrangement by making analytical moves, again, from different methodologies, it could be on research design, data collection, data analysis, data presentation, things such as that. And part of it is just recognizing that different methodologies have different strengths. And this is something I didn't figure out to probably 10 years into the field. That, for example, case studies are awesome for study design. They really, I think they help me think through different questions about who I want to study, why I want to study them. But I don't find case particularly that strong on the analytical part. That's why I like that Kathy's finally come out with the paper on it, but because her original AMR paper largely, I think largely said use grounded theory. Because grounded theory, on the other hand, is great for analysis. It doesn't say quite as much on how to design a study, some, but not as much. And ethnography is great. Ethnography actually, to me, in some ways is great because it it does talk about how you design a study. It talks about how to analyze data, but also to me has really great ways of thinking about how to gather data. So I don't know if you're not familiar with something called the Grand Tour question. It's a lovely way to start interviews. It's, take me through a day of yours. There's different ways, you could have, take me through a particular procedure, particular practice. But I really like, I like Spradley's work because I find it's a great way to kind of get into the data collection process. Ethnography also great because it has, bump my thing. It also has, participant observation, which I find incredibly effective if you could do it. So they give me an example, like, what do I mean by unique problem? So back in 2003, one of my early works, I was working with a marketing professor, and we were kind of interested in this question. Why do network marketing organizations like Amway and Mary Kay, Longaberger, Shackley, why do they seem to highlight work-family tensions when most organizations seem to run away from them? And so we had two challenges here. One challenge was, well, this goes against the research because the research, existing research at this time said this is exactly what you shouldn't do. And the other thing is, this was a question that kind of came up in my Amway data, and we decided to collect more data with two different contexts. But at the time, there was nothing that, there's more now, but at the time, there was nothing on how do you combine qualitative data sets. So we had to kind of figure that out as we went along, but that was another challenge of ours. So how do we bricolage it? Well, again, so one of the things is we used our logic for why we picked the two extra cases beyond Amway. We use case study design to justify that. We talked about why we use inductive ethnography for inductive data collection in Amway, because we wouldn't have got to this question in the first place. Why we use grounded theory for our analysis, because what highlights grounded theory used for us. So because we had something that was new to the field, we had to spend a lot of time on legitimacy, like you had to trust what we're doing. And because we're combining multiple data sets, we kind of had to be creative on figuring out, well, what's the logic? And we actually end up using grounded theory logic to explain, we can kind of think of our first cases, looking at first order codes, and second and third is helping us move along in the analysis. Again, it wasn't a perfect analogy, but we're just trying to figure out how do we explain to somebody who's never read a paper with multiple qualitative data sets that this is actually something that's practical, legitimate to do. And by no means this is a perfect paper, but it kind of shows that every paper will have its own unique challenges that you have to essentially address. So one way to think about trustworthiness then is, rather than looking at internal reliability, external reliability, reliability, internal validity, things such as that, you can think about trustworthy as going back to the very definition of like what makes for trustworthiness. And so Mayer et al. Talk about there are three things that comprise trustworthiness: competence, integrity, and benevolence. And so we actually looked at about a dozen or so qualitative papers in top tier journals. Again, we try to get very different approaches and say, well, how do they communicate trustworthiness? And we found that, they did it by displaying competence, integrity, and benevolence. But again, it's not exactly a one-to-one to the trust research. So for competence, like, how do you show that the researchers know what they're doing? Well, one way is actually, citing external sources, like valid sources. And by valid sources, by the way, I'm going to talk about this later, but when you're trying to convince somebody to know a methodology, don't just cite method sections of other articles, cite the books, cite the articles that are methodological articles. So that when I mean externally valid, I just mean that somebody other than you has used this method. Integrity, like we talked about cohesiveness before, like how does my research question fit my analysis? So if I'm doing a process theorizing, my first look for process theorizing is Anne Langley's work. And one of the things that she suggests to do is, come up with a timeline. And so I've done a few studies where I'm looking at the same organization over time. And one of the first things we do is we set out a timeline to say, okay, what were the main events that happened? But that fits a longitudinal developmental process-oriented research question. And finally, benevolence. This doesn't mean being nice to the people you study, though you should try not to do violence to experience. But it also means, are you true to your data, right? There's always going to be a translation gap between what, how your informants see the world. And I think of this as a translation process. I'm translating almost to a different language. Another language is academics. So there's always going to be a little slippage, but you try to minimize that slippage so that the voice of the people you're studying somehow comes up in the research that you're doing. So if you want to know more about it, there's a table. I think it was table 1 or something in our study. We give a lot of examples for that. So why would you use methodological bricolage? Well, the pro, I think it really helps you. You really have to know your data. You really have to think deeply about, am I using the right kind of analysis? What are the challenges in my particular research study? And I think it just helps you do a deeper, richer analysis of your data, no matter what method you're using, or what methodological move you're using. Secondly, what you're doing, this is not an anything goes, like all things are equally good. You're showing that the solutions you come up with are actually helping you address your particular research question. So it's really designing things for your unique project. And the good news, I think it could result in methodological innovations. I'm not sure, but I imagine that the data structure that Joya came up with was probably, actually I'm pretty sure of it, because I ended up asking, like, how did he come up with this? And I also asked Linda Johansson at ASQ, and it sounds like the data structure came up because the reviewers were getting confused for how he went from it was Denny and some colleagues on a paper, how he went from his codes to his theoretical model. And they kind of worked back and forth and figured out this solution. So great solution to the particular problem that they had. The other thing I think is just really good, it helps you identify where do we not have good analytical moves. I particularly think, and it's not just me, we're not really good at coding yet. And I think we're especially not good at how you move from codes to theorizing. I think if you read a lot of the books and chapters out there, you kind of think it's like this magical process that happens. I think we could do better. We found very little moves on how do you move from coding to theorizing. I know that, again, in the special issue that came out, Martha Feldman, Karen Locke, and Karen Goldenblatt, I think, came out with a whole paper on coding. So that's a step in the right direction. The cons of this approach, nothing is perfect, is that you don't want to have a 25-page method section. So you want to be able to justify your decisions, but you're not taking somebody through every agonizing decision you make. Like, talk about what your final decision was. You're not going to say, we thought about sampling these people. We collected a few interviews. That didn't work out. So we decided to do a few more people. Then we thought maybe that didn't work out. And then and then 10 pages later, you said, and we ended up with X. How about just say we ended up with X for this reason? So, to try not to be too verbose. Second thing, it has to be done mindfully. And that, again, it really has to be thought through. And the problem, or the challenge I think it has, is that you have to be a pretty sophisticated methodologist to really do it well. And you have to have pretty sophisticated reviewers and editors too, because there's some sophistication of realizing that you can mix case studies and grounded theories. So it's not a method necessarily for everyone. If you're interested in doing this methodology, I'll just give you some tips that I'm not sure all these are in the paper, but I thought about it for this talk. Like, what would be some tips? One is, I tend to find it's really good to be an expert in something first before you start bricolaging. So what I have found, my first forward was into ethnography. Got to know ethnography pretty well. And then I learned grounded theory. But having known ethnography really well, I could see the parallels with grounded theory and on how I could borrow things. So Prasad has, and again, another nice book out there on qualitative methodology. So be an expert first. Second thing, again, I'm a big proponent of reading methodology books and methodology articles. I mean, I have people that have cited some of my papers on their method sections, but they're citing method sections of my papers. It's flattering, but I don't think, I actually would rather them not cite my method section, but like read Strauss and Corbin, or read Glaser, or read Sharmas. Read where, kind of the, or read articles that are specifically about methods, not just method sections. Thirdly, get methods training. Not every school, I realize, has methodological courses. I feel really lucky being here at BC that I'm able to offer a qualitative methods course every other year. But that's pretty rare. It's not been every job I've had that allowed that. But karma, by the way, is not the philosophical karma. It's a Center for the Advancement of Research Methods and Analysis. They do things out of, I think now it's out of Texas. Larry Williams is the head person on that. They have things every summer for methodological workshops. I've taught beginning qualitative methods for years. The Erasmus Research Institute and for Management, they had one this summer on qualitative and methodology. And I find they're popping up more and more places. So again, if you can, some of these are only, I tend to do a 2.5 day section, but they're 8 hours a day. So I mean, you get a lot in a short amount of time. But I think any training you can have is good. Apprenticeship is also excellent if you can get it. So do what you can. And then the other thing is, when you think about methods, this is something I guess that came to me as we wrote the paper. This is something you set up in your introduction. It's when you talk about your research question, it's stuff that you're going to follow through with in your limitations section. So when you're thinking about methods, you're not just thinking about the method section. This is stuff that is actually going to be important in your entire article. So to conclude, then we'll go back to questions. Again, think about the talk. The purpose of the talk is really to think about, how do I make a trustworthy method section? There is some debate. There is some disagreement. There has been a trend recently towards templates. We're going to argue that, again, templates could be, again, I want to say templates can be fine if they're used in a mindful fashion. The other way to think about templates is you can break them up into different moves, right? So you don't have to do the entire Joya method to use the data structure. The data structure may be good, depending on your research question. But so think about them in that way. And then, the one sentence takeaway is, be mindful of what you're doing. We all make judgment calls in research. Nothing is a perfect grounded theory study. Nothing's a perfect ethnography. Nothing's a perfect case study. You're always going to make decisions. Your job is to let the reviewer know what decisions you made and provide some justification for it. So why don't we open it back up to questions? And thank you.
Thank you, Mike. If you don't have any more slides, do you want to stop sharing? And that way we can see
absolutely
more easily.
Wunderbar. Good. All right. Questions, thoughts? I see a couple hands up. I don't know who was first though. So I'm going to let Ibrat, I give him the thing about figuring out who was first. How about that?
I don't see any hands. I think that maybe.
Oh, you don't?
Yeah,
all right.
They're clapping.
Okay. So I'm not, if I slide your name, my apology in advance.
Ekaterina's got her hands up.
Judah or Jutta had your hands up, but then she put her hand down. Now I'm worried. Oh, okay. Thank you. Great. All right. So, thank you. I'm sorry. I'm so bad at names. And if it's recorded, I'll be bad with names throughout history. So, can you pronounce your name first so I know how to say it?
It's Ekaterina.
Ekaterina. Thank you.
Yes, that's good. Yeah. Hi. So thank you for your presentation. And I don't have much of it. Maybe like there's a question, but also quite a comment that you mentioned that this template type of research narrows down our scope of knowledge of other methods. But if, at least from my perspective and from what I experience, if I go to any qualitative method course here, like I'm studying in Finland or mostly in Europe, every time you talk about qualitative methods, it's either a case study you have, and then you have grounded theory. And if you're lucky enough, you can have some information on narrative and discourse analysis. And this is pretty much it. So for so long time, I only thought that, okay, if it's qualitative study, it's either case study or narrative analysis. And that was it. So then the question is, what other qualitative methods are there that are worth of our attention, but that still kind of unrecognized or unemphasized, and how to find them?
There's a lot. I think discourse analysis, I think, is really good. I actually think Spradley has an ethnographic book on how you analyze language, which I find quite helpful. He talks about different kinds of analyses, taxonomic analyses. I don't remember all three of them, but I found those really helpful. There is a great, I want to say it was a hermeneutic study. It was actually an early Steve Barley study on funeral homes that talked about how the placement of the body was trying to reflect people in their living people. I think that was hermeneutics. I think largely we get limited in our research questions when we're limited in our methodologies. And so part of it is, to me, expanding your knowledge of methods, I think, will also help people expand their knowledge of what's possible to study. I think even with narrative analysis, I think there's some out there. There's not a ton, but you could look at like Dave Bogey's work is very different than, let's say, Scott Sonenshein's work. He did something like he collapsed a lot of narratives into a meta narrative, and so that's very different. Some people are critical management. Like I found discourse analysis. If you're interested in more kind of critical management perspectives, I've seen a lot of people do that. We use like a discourse analysis. There's probably more, but after talking for an hour and a half, that's all I got.
With narrative analysis is also quite interesting, because then you have it also comes to how you define the narrative. Like sometimes it can be just a tool, and there are so many varieties of tools that you can use to analyze the data in a narrative sort of way. Yep.
That's why I really like the idea of moves. Like you could take some interesting things from narrative analysis. You could take some interesting things from hermeneutics and phenomenology. I'm sorry. The other things I think that is really interesting, there's video methods in general. There was a special issue in organizational research methods. By the way, I'm not on their board. I don't get paid for, I don't think I'm on their board. I might still be on the board. Anyway, I get no promotion money from talking about organizational research methods, but they also had a video ethnography, a video methods thing, which I think is pretty good. Netnography, I think, is really fascinating. It's ethnographic studies of online communities. Again, I think given pandemic, post-pandemic world, I would love to see more people really use that. There was a paper on an ASQ just came out on Anonymous, the online group that uses netnography. So that'd be another thing to look at. I think the only challenge is if you're using a method that's not one of the big three, you have to spend a little bit more time justifying what the method is. But I think I have to say, I think it's worth it.
Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you.
Yep. You brought.
Mike, just on this topic that you mentioned of, doing online-based research. I mean, considering in view of the pandemic, I suppose a lot of qualitative researchers would have struggled to access, particularly those who wanted to do, case study based in the organization, ended up doing it online. Do you have any views or, perhaps concerns or traps that people might fall into if they never actually step a foot into the organization itself, nonetheless doing, a case study using interviews, maybe observations and archival data sources?
Yeah, I think a lot depends on your research question and what you're trying to show. If you're trying to get a deep cultural analysis of an organization that's primarily face-to-face and you're doing mostly online, I think that's a problem. But if you're doing a cultural study of a group that's mostly on Zoom these days, then being on Zoom is perfect, right? My bias, and it could be just because of my age, is I really like face-to-face interviews. I like to be able to be there, know how things are going. I get some nonverbals on Zoom, but not. I think there is something about being there, hanging out with people. But again, I think it really depends on what your research question is. There's again another paper that's under review, so I can't say much about it. That was looking at how organizations were using online third spaces, And so, yeah, their hangout was hanging out in a, in a third space platform. There's also a book, I think it was like, I was a night elf priestess, maybe not be exactly it, but somebody did an online ethnography of World of Warcraft. And how they did that, they got an avatar and had that. So, I think, but I guess my concern is that, and I'm, by the way, I'm not one of these believers that the office is dead. I still think that people need it face to face, but there may be more things being done online. And so if that's the case, we need to be where the action is. And so I think we need to kind of maybe hone up more on how we gather data and not just take it as face-to-face light, but what are the unique strengths and weaknesses of using online methods.
Thank you, Mike. I think we have one more hand raised.
Yeah, Siobhan. You're muted.
Hi, can you hear me?
Barely.
Okay,
Like-
sorry.
Okay, that's good.
Bit difficult. I'm not working in my normal environment. Thank you for the talk, first of all. I'm using reflective thematic analysis, which, is the latest sort of version of thematic analysis. And I'm trying to figure out, having read your paper a few weeks ago, how to go about demonstrating the competence and the integrity and benevolence and things while using reflexive, because there's things like triangulation of data that they don't advise. I don't know. Yeah.
What's your research question you're asking?
It's looking just at managers at the moment and trying to understand how they experience employee disengagement.
Okay. And so what method? So tell me, it's what you said you use reflexiveness?
Yeah, so basically I'm going to be using reflexive thematic analysis to analyze the data.
Okay.
I've done 15 interviews at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
And Lyndon Garrett brought your paper to my attention, and that's because in the creation of the interview schedule, I wanted to kind of use repertory grid technique in order to kind of gather some constructs in a concise way, but also use a more traditional structure for the rest of the interview to get at, well, the qualitative experience more. And so there's quite a lot going on, and I just want to understand whether all these things I can kind of put them together coherently, if that makes sense.
So I don't know the methodology you're using, but my sense is that it's, you justify just simply saying, partly, I would have to guess that it's a lot about people thinking deeply about something, right?
Yeah,
Maybe that's
absolutely. Yeah, and just this whole thing about triangulation, the focus is on what I bring to it as an interviewer as well. It's about not trying to escape from the fact that my thoughts are going to be in the analysis as well. Whereas in qualitative, sometimes efforts are made to try and limit that. Yes, they still are here, but we're almost embracing the fact that there will be a bit of me in that analysis as well.
I think there's always a bit of everyone in their analysis, and I think that's okay. I think,
Yeah.
we are the SPSS, we are the R, we are the, I don't know if anybody still uses Stata, but anyway, but we are the instrument. So I think it's inevitable that we will be, that we're going to be in that we will be reflected in the data analysis. I don't think there's no way around. There's no way around that. I think, again, depending on what camp you're in, will depend on what you do with that, right? So if you look at the trustworthy camp of, I want to be more positivist, and it's all about, well, anything that's you is going to be biased, and I want to get that out of there. So you're going to be able, then you're going to have to talk about, well, how did I try to overcome my biases? Where are my biases? Did I check my biases? Did I, Martha Feldman has a nice thing, like she talks about, when you start to expect something, what would you have to see to essentially change your mind? So there's some techniques you could use on that. But if, other people embrace full on, social constructioning and just say, that way you're kind of co-constructing your paper with the people that you've done it with. So I guess there's a lot of different ways to think about your involvement. I just think you have to talk about, I sometimes talk about, it's a challenging question because I think different journals and different people have very different standards for how acceptable it is to bring yourself in. But everybody knows that you can't, like, you can never go into a study blank slate, and you can never not have yourself in the analysis. So I think the degree to which you can talk about, to the degree to which what you saw is who you are, I think that's helpful. Again, they just help the reviewers be able to do it, and then do things like, member checks or peer debriefings is a nice way to kind of show that, yes, I'm certainly in this, but I also talk to other people to get their perspective. So it's not just what you don't want is this is just my take on what I saw, right? You're not doing adequate, you're not giving the voice to the people that you studied enough credit, that you're kind of overriding them with what you think. Like, and again, there's going to be a degree to that, but you don't want to overpower your data.
No, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you. No
problem. Now, Jed does have a question. All right, go for it.
Hi there. Thank you so much. I literally got a very quick question following on from Siobhan. This peer review, or not peer review, but peer checks or member checks with other people that you're working with, I've actually never seen this documented. And I've done something like that with a data set that I'm struggling with. But how do you imagine doing this? So I've had quarterly meetings with people who've commissioned the work that I've been doing. And I can't imagine, like, it's data, right? But it's not really, it's informal data. But how on earth do you document that? And how on earth do you communicate it with, for example, with quarterly meetings with people who know this, the participants? Like, what does it look like?
Yeah, no, I think there might be a section of the Joya method about that. Okay. I know that we drew upon, so Lily Crosina and I wrote a paper on Lehman Brothers and what happened when Lehman Brothers collapsed. And it was her third-year paper. So she collected all the data, and I was kind of the person she met with more than quarterly, probably every other week. And so we talked about that process, how what role did I play? Like, I played a devil's advocate role, and how that helped, what was that, how I helped, my role in that process, because I wasn't collecting the data, but I certainly was doing something, and it was certainly changing how she thought about things. So, yeah, I think we talked about, so there are sections in that paper, there's section in the Joy paper. I've seen it more often. If you can't find it, shoot me an email, and I will at least send you our paper and tell you how we got over that problem.
It's amazing. Thank you so much.
You'll find that qualitative methodologists will often write something because they want to cite it later. So if it's not there, somebody needs to write a chapter so we all can cite it. It happens all the time.
Mike, there's a question in the chat from Emma. What is your position on intervention research? Is it a delicate choice for a PhD?
I think it depends. Well, it really depends on what kind of job you want to get when you're out and where you want to get your job. I mean, I'm certainly all for, insider, outsider, action research. It's all, to me, there's all legitimate methods, but I do find that there are more biases in certain markets than others. If you're going to a Dust Bowl empiricist, place, I hate to use too many stereotypes, but so I won't. But I do think you're going to have a harder time in some schools than others, and I think you may have some harder times at the more traditional journals that just aren't used to seeing that. So you'll have to do. I think you'd have to do a little bit more justification for why it was an appropriate method. But again, we just don't see a lot of it. So I think I guess in short, there's nothing wrong with the methodology. It all depends on the research question. But I do know I've been around the field long enough. I do know we do have prejudices around some methods are better than others, even if we shouldn't. But I do think you'll have a harder time at a traditional school or especially one that's more quantitative than qualitative. And at some of the top journals that I think the journals have gotten a ton better, by the way, of being open about different qualitative methodologies. But I do think there's still a ways to go.
And Mike, whilst we're waiting maybe for more questions to come through, from your experience as a reviewer and an editor, what would you suggest, perhaps some tips or traps to watch out for that you recommend to doctoral students who want to publish qualitative research?
Wow, that could be an entire 2.5 hour session in and of itself. But
well, we
I
have
can't
that
say,
time, right?
Yeah, but not 2.5 hours. So I can't say there's, I talked about, qualitative researchers write things to help people out. So I would say that the editorial I wrote in 2009 at AMJ and the article called Oval Pegs in Organizational Research Methods are all about this exact thing. How do you publish? Because again, at the end of the day, I'm a very practical person. So what traps do people fall in when they're publishing? So let me just talk about some offhand, but those would be the two sources that I would move you to. The first thing is, I think almost everybody gets their theory and data misaligned the first time through. And so how do you get an R&R? Get an R&R by having like really a solid method. Like I have to think that your methods are good, and I have to think you have good data. So there has to be some potential there. And what I tend to find, and again, it depends on the person. Like sometimes I find like there are all the people who've done like a 6-case case study, and they have so much data that they don't show any of the data. They just describe what their data is like. And so again, Golden Biddle Locke's book, Composing Qualitative Research, they talk about that they're doing all telling and no showing. And so a big mistake, I think, for first time submissions is that people do a lot of telling about their data, not enough showing. The problem with this is that if the theory and methods are misaligned, which you often are, I can't give you any advice for how to fix it because I don't see any of your raw data. The papers that I've had that have transformed the most, and I think are the best, are papers where I have a lot of data where the reviewer said, you're framing it this way, but I look at your data and you seem like you have a story about something else. So the whole thing on identity construction with physicians, that idea came from a reviewer. That was not our original intent. So, but we were able to have that because we showed a fair amount of data. Second thing, like I said, have a really strong method section. So walk people through what you did. Well, I have to have confidence that you know what you're doing. So all the stuff I talked about today, are all important. I think, the third mistake, I don't see this as often. As again, I think people try to mimic quantitative analyses, hoping that the quantitative reviewers will be happy with it. Or sometimes I think people are doing more mixed methods papers, which in theory is awesome. In practicality, I think I find them difficult. So as an editor for mixed methods papers, so what they'll do is they'll add a quantitative study, hoping that it'll be more palatable to reviewers. But there are not many people who are equally good at qualitative and quantitative. So I tend to see papers that are either really good qualitative with the meh quantitative, a good quantitative study with a slapped on qualitative. And so it's problematic. Let's see what other hints. Oh, read the journal. Know what people, this is a very basic thing. What is a journal publishing? How do people write their papers? You don't have to like mimic exactly the style, but I have papers that don't even have the journal formatting in it. I can especially tell papers that are rejected at AMJ, they come to ASQ, that are still formatted as an AMJ paper. And quite honestly, it seems like a really stupid thing, but the reviewers already have a story in their heads like, oh, this got rejected someplace, probably not a good paper. Why should we accept it if AMJ did not? Oh, okay, one more thing. Don't do the spaghetti at the wall approach. So some people, again, you don't really know what's interesting in your paper, so you write about like a dozen interesting things and hoping that the reviewer is going to latch on to one of them and like it. I tend to find that's usually not the case. The people tend to find it just really confusing. So don't do it. Be my suggestion. Yeah, Judah. Judah?
It's Utah. It's designed to confuse you. Hi.
Utah, no, that's good.
Thank you so much. I've just got another question, and I'm hoping it's useful to other people as well. So I've got flawed data. I'm very happy to admit that I've got flawed data, but it's data that I think asks questions. Because at the beginning of when you talked to us, I said, do qual research to create new testable propositions, right? To create, is that not what you said?
No, it is not what I said.
Is that not what you said?
No, I mean, I think there's certain perspectives that would say that. Again, if you're on the more positive, again, this is where there's different camps. Like,
Okay.
I don't think I really don't create testable hypotheses in my research. And certainly, if I did it earlier in my career, I don't really do it now. But that's a very specific take on qualitative. The qualitative is essentially pre-science or pre-quant. I would say I moved quite a bit away from that. But again, there are people who do see it that way. So again, I just had a paper on the Eisenhardt method, and this is what she said. She goes, the reason I'm doing this is to create testable propositions. So that is a camp, but it's not everybody's camp. So I'm glad you said that, because if they walked away with that, I would feel sad.
Can I ask my question anyway and see if you have some advice?
Sure.
So even if this, right? So if this is just where I'm at, I've got data, very interesting context. I won't have a chance to go back. I've made choices, and I've got effectively incomplete data. I wish I had more different kind of angles onto it. And I've done something similar for my dissertation research 10 years ago, and I've got it published after a long time of working. What's the story, and how realistic is what I can say? What's still based on the data, right? And I'm 10 years later in a similar position. What advice would you give to somebody like that? And I wonder if other people are in a similar position. Like, we want to be honest, right? We want to be credible, but we also want to admit where we're wrong, and where we've got not incomplete quants data, but we've got choice. We've made choices, but we think they point to questions. That's why I was saying, this is explorative stuff. It's in contexts where we can't go back and ask more questions.
Yep. What
would your advice be?
So what I tend to find in that situation is really knowing what your data are. When I think of data that are flawed, it's sometimes they're flawed, but I think more often they're not the data you want to answer your research question. But you may have data that can answer another research question. So for example, I really want to understand why CEOs make termination decisions, but I never got a chance to see them make any termination decisions at all. But what I do have is I have how they think about it. So I could write a research question on how people think about terminating, but I don't have the data on how they actually terminate. So I tend to find when people think their data is flawed is because they have this, we all have these questions in our head, like, oh, I gathered data for this question in mind. And we look back, I said, I do not have the data that I thought I had. Or maybe I have something different. So part of it is really understanding what data you have and being honest about that. I mean, you don't want to like blare out your flaws to your reviewers, but I do think about it more of, what do I have? What questions can I answer with your data? Even if it wasn't the questions you ultimately wanted to ask.
Thank you. This is super helpful.
No problem. Bertha.
Hello there. Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Oh, yes. What really attracted me was your observation that very many have a purpose statement. Would you say
you're cutting in and out, so I'm going to ask you to repeat that again.
Okay. What caught my attention in your presentation, one of the things that caught my attention was that many journal articles you've observed don't have a purpose statement, a purpose. They don't state their purpose. Would you say something more about that? Because I sense that a lot of our training, we've had an emphasis on making sure you have your position clear, and the statement doesn't always come out. Would you just say something more about the purpose statement and why it really needs to stand out?
Yes, I think so. I'm not sure. It was not something it's not something I intended to communicate, other than when I talk about you need, I guess, not a purpose statement, and we think about a purpose statement for like in a business, okay. But we're talking about why are you doing this research?
Okay.
So that's what I talked about. Like, what was the reason for doing this research? And here's another, just going back to Pratt's question, another big mistake that people do is that people don't motivate their studies well, right? So that's another way to think about your purpose, right? Let me tell you what's a bad way. I got a couple of bad ways to motivate. One is that a lot of people are really good at coming up with gaps.
Yes.
but they're not good at talking about why it's important to fill those gaps. So I apologize. I use this example all the time, but it works. That is, there's no paper out there that I'm aware of that looks at why leaders choose the socks they wear in the morning. So leader sock preference, LSP. There's no, as far as I know, no paper on that. That's a gap in literature, but I don't think, but I'm not sure anybody cares. So gap does not equal. So you have to have something called a theoretical hook, and it has to be theoretical. So why does it matter theoretically? How is existing theory wrong or in some ways? Don't say that theory is incomplete, because all theory is incomplete, right? It's, the map is not the territory. So people say, well, we could add more nuance to this theory. If I could, I don't know if I had a magic wish, I would get rid of the word nuance in all qualitative papers, because more nuance doesn't do anything. I mean, necessarily. If I'm going to, any theory could be made more complicated, but it's an abstraction of reality. So by definition, it's not as nuanced as it could be. If you're going to use nuance as an example for why you're motivating your study, I want to know, do I get a lot of bang for the buck for making it more complicated? Because I can make any theory more complicated. So don't do that. So those are the two biggies that I see. Or don't motivate with a phenomenological hook. So organizations are changing. Yes, we all know that. But I'm seeing a lot of, COVID-19 has changed how we looked at work. That could be true. That is a phenomenological hook, which gets the reader involved, but it's not a theoretical hook. Like, I want to know, what do we not know theoretically about this phenomena that we should know, and why is it what we know not correct? Does that help?
Very much. Thank you very much.
No problem. And thank you for clarifying that. That's great.
And on that, Mike, on the hook, can you start with the phenomenological hook, but proceed to theoretical hook?
Yeah. Absolutely. Just don't stop there. And I've been guilty of that myself, where you get so into your phenomenological hook, you forget the theoretical hook. But yeah, I mean, I love starting papers that way. You just can't, that could be your intro, but it can't be ultimately why you're doing the paper.
Thank you. Alicia has a hand.
Hi, Michael. I actually just wanted to pick your brain on something. We're talking about digital platforms and collecting data through digital means, because that's where the world is going on some levels. What are your thoughts on collecting data from archived video footage that can range from sound bites to like an hour-long talk that someone gives at a particular conference or something like that? Do you think there's usefulness in that, or are there pitfalls in looking at that sort of data?
All right. So there's always pitfalls for anything. There's always trade-offs. But I do think, I mean, it depends on your research questions. If your research question is how have people talked about or made accounts for certain things, then past archival stuff could be great. My worry is that if it's, I like how you said sound bites and longer things. My worry about sound bites is that they're so thin. They're so little. It's like when people analyze the open-ended parts of their questionnaires, yes, you can get some data from it, but it's usually very thin data. So, but I think you could answer a lot of interesting, because archives, especially public archives, are a public statement about what how people think. And so that, to me, that's, you could look at how people have like justified certain decisions and use an archival analysis and see how that justification has changed over the years. That'd be really cool. But again, all depends on the research question.
Cool. Thank you, Michael.
You're welcome. Other thoughts? I'm impressed how many people have hung it out. That's good.
Hello.
Yep.
I have a question. Thank you very much for your presentation. I was wondering, following Bertha's question about the purpose of the paper, whether it's building, elaborating, or testing theory. And I was thinking, if you have a topic on which it's not per se that you have a clear theory that you are building upon, or you think that current theories cannot really explain it, and you conduct a qualitative study, Does that mean that you necessarily are building a new theory, and that means that you need to result in your paper in some sort of a theory, or because that sounds that then you end up in a grounded theory approach where you need to come up with something big? So are these three clear-cut sort of options that you can have with the purpose of the paper?
That's a kind of a general hypothetical, so it's hard. It's hard to answer. In general, first of all, I think in some ways your job is harder than it was when I was in graduate school or junior faculty member. The fact that Google Scholar has now made available every single paper written on any single subject. I mean, a lot of stuff. So I think arguing that there's no theory that exists nowadays is a really tough bar. I think it's a tough bar to hurdle. Possible, but I think increasingly unlikely. I think the best thing we can do is probably talk about the different theories only look at a limited part of a larger phenomena. So I talk about in my organization research methods paper the importance of creating theoretical frames. So essentially, some theories have those different things about different parts of it, but there's a big part in the middle we don't know anything about. So it will lead you, if you don't have theory, to a theory building thing. Can you do a paper that's not theory building? Is probably yes, but will it get published? Probably not, or at least not published in a top tier journal, because most top tier journals, at least North America top tier journals, really emphasize theoretical contribution. So if you're not building theory, you're not elaborating theory, then you're probably just doing description. And that for most journals, that's not going to be enough. And that actually reminds me yet of another problem or another thing that I see a lot from a lot of papers is that people do theoretical description without theory building. And let me tell you what the difference is. So if you take your data and you say, this part of my data could be explained by theory 1, this part of my data could be explained by theory 2, and this part of my data could be explained by theory 3. What you've done is you've engaged in theoretical description. You've used existing theory to explain what your data is about. The problem with this is you haven't done anything, you haven't really pushed the boundaries of knowledge forward. All you've done is be able to create your, talk about your story in a different way. To push the boundaries forward, you want to say, well, what's new? How am I moving forward theory 1? How am I moving forward theory 2? Or how am I moving forward theory 3? So I'm not sure that was the answer you were hoping for, but that was probably the best I got. Thanks.
Mike, maybe just one more question from me.
Promises.
You alluded a number of times. I mean, considering, I suppose people who come to this call would be interested in qualitative research, but also you alluded to case studies and using multiple methods to triangulate. Could you comment on, how to make good use of different methods, particularly like more classic ones, such as interviews and observations and archival data, but to use them judiciously in order to elaborate on a theory or, build a good case?
Yep. So I wouldn't consider interviewing necessarily a method. I would say interviewing is a skill or a technique we use in a lot of different methods. I just tell you how could just be my own bias. So when I teach qualitative methods, I actually start with teaching how to build a research question, how to get access to an organization, how to design a study, how to gather data, and then I do interviews and observations. Because I think those are kind of common across all methods, but an ethnographic interview is different than like a narrative interview, for example. So just want to be clear. So when I talk about that methods, I'm talking about more as usually a part of another method, maybe like a technique or a practice. And I think again, your question, I think really it goes back. I know it sounds like a broken record, but actually, what's the analogy of broken record nowadays? People don't use records. I guess to not repeat myself, it really goes back to the research question. So what are interviews good for? Interviews are really good for getting in people's heads, sense making, understanding stuff. What are they not good for? Factual data. If you want to do an historical analysis for what happened, interviews, there's a lot of recall bias. So I think if you want to get objective facts from interviews, I think you're going to have some challenges. Archival, like you're doing like a historical longitudinal study. Archival data is really good, especially if you're looking at questions about how organizations are presenting themselves, because usually public archives are, doesn't get at the behind the scenes conversations for what happened. It's whatever people agreed on. Okay, we can put this out into the public sphere. So really thinking about, what is the best data for the particular research question that I have? So is it getting in people's heads? Looking up, am I doing an institutional study? Maybe I want to do more archival stuff. If it's how do I really understand why people work the way they work, then maybe you want to do a participant observation. So again, it really depends on your research, on the research question that you have.
Thank you, Mike. I don't see any other questions or hands raised. Maybe this could be a good point to bring the session to the end.
Jonas decided to put a little problem on that ending. So yes, Jonas.
Sorry, just want to steal another minute of your time.
Fine.
Thanks a lot. What I really loved about this was that you explained the things you've all read somewhere before in very clear and informative ways. Thanks a lot.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yeah, maybe you can help me with another thing, and that's this term of thick and thin data. So I hear that flying around a lot, but I have a bit of trouble understanding.
Sorry, just was flying around. I had to duck.
Oh yeah, hi, got it. What exactly is meant with thick and thin, right? Because the way I see it, it shouldn't just be the number of stuff, right? You don't want to quantify. So what is meant by thin and thick?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it is how deep is the explanation, right? So I could talk about, I felt happy today. And I could do event methods where you beep somebody in the middle of the day on their Apple Watch and you say, okay, fill out a survey. Are you happy or sad? That's data, but it's thin data because it doesn't give you a lot of insight. But if I had an interview and they could say, okay, well, why are you happy? Well, I'm happy because I got to talk with a bunch of people from around the world, got to interact with some interesting folks. We actually seeing sun for, which is a rare event in Boston in November, so rich data is one, I think, that goes beyond that. It kind of gives an explanation for why or how. It doesn't just say what. So I think like a lot of thin data it's data that you can't really, I hate to see you dig deep. You can't just dig deep into it because there just isn't anything there. And again, it's not the quantity of data. I could have 10,000 one sentence answers to what is your affective state, or I can have 1 hour interview on somebody's affective states and have exactly the same numbers, but a much richer data in the latter than the former. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thanks a lot.